Hi, my name is Jeremy Keele. I'm the president and CEO of the Sorenson Impact Center. I'm with Congressman John Delaney from the state of Maryland. Congressman, it's so good to be with you.
Great to be with you, Jeremy.
Thanks for spending a few minutes. It was great to have you keynote our conference here in Salt Lake. I wanted to touch on something in just the short few minutes that we have together that you highlighted in your talk, which is really you have this really tremendous private sector background, which I think is pretty unique for a lot of folks in government. You started two companies that went on to become publicly traded companies. So you have this tremendous background from the private sector, and I think what I've gathered from my interactions with you over the years is that that's really sort of influenced the way you think about policy and government. And you strike me as sort of one of the real thought leaders in Congress around how you infuse innovation, private investment, and some of the kind of private sector discipline and focus on accountability into some of the way we think about solving social problems. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. This conference is a huge success, and it's really, I feel very privileged to be part of it. The private sector taught me many things, and one of the things it taught me was that if you really want a good economy, you have to get everyone working together. You have to get the government working well together, you got to get the private sector working well together, and you have to get the nonprofit sector working well together. And that kind of animates everything that I do in public policy. And if you think about some of the issues we have in society, some of the really big issues we have in society, we're going to have to make some transformative investments. We're going to need some innovation, and we're going to have to do a much better job tracking results and looking at metrics and doing all that kind of analytical work that you find in the private sector. So the best way to make that happen, it seems to me, is for the government, which is the last mile in all of these issues, right? Whether it be education or healthcare or housing issues or climate change or the opportunity gap. The government is obviously central and essential to any solution against those problems. But to the extent the government can partner with the private sector and the nonprofit sector, because I think both of them are really important here, you get the perfect situation because you can get some additional capital, which is needed, right? The government's ability to invest a lot of money at this point is very limited when you look at the fiscal situation of the government. Yet there's a huge amount of capital outside of government, and much of that capital would like to be deployed against some of these big issues. So by partnering, you not only get capital, but you get all that innovation that just totally drives the private sector and really changes the world. So you get that innovation engine working against these issues. And then you get the discipline that you talked about, where results are measured, and you get a feedback loop, either a negative or positive feedback loop, and then you start changing and making adjustments and innovating to better answers. So that's why this notion of bringing those parties together, whether it be for pay for success framework or social impact bonds or any of the other kind of terms or strategies that are used for the relationship, I think is so important.
You have taken up this legislation that we've worked on together around social impact bonds. Yes. That would really kind of engage the federal government in a way that's just never, been possible in the past. Can you tell us a little bit more about not just the legislation, but also sort of the traction that it's gotten in your body, in the Senate, sort of what you think the prospects are for that?
So what our legislation does is create a $100 million fund within the Department of Treasury. And this legislation passed overwhelmingly in the House last Congress. It almost passed in the Senate, but it wasn't considered at the end. And we feel very confident that it'll get considered this year. So what the $100 million will be used for by the Department of Treasury, it'll be made available to local governments, because all this is happening at the local government level. That's where all the action is on all these kind of programs. The $100 million can fund grants so that the local governments can bring in the expertise they need to set up these programs. It can actually use to make success payments to the extent the local government needs to bring in kind of a government partner to help prime the pump with the private sector. And then it can be used to fund kind of the analytical work about how the projects ultimately worked out. It provided that information to share.
Going back to that measurement
piece. So it's very bipartisan. And what we're really trying to do is take what's happening in places like Salt Lake City and other local governments around the country where they have these innovative programs in education, which is what we see here in Salt Lake City. I talked in my speech about what's happening with asthma in Los Angeles, and there's several other programs like this happening all around the country. And we want that to be replicated across the country. And we think the federal government can play a role in helping induce the local governments, if you will, to think about this as a way of providing government services, as opposed to the old model where the government tried to do it all. Bring in partners, bring in the nonprofit sector, bring in the private sector, structure programs that you only pay these partners if they get the outcomes that you desire, and really try to make a difference against some of these very, very significant structural problems we have.
The scope and the magnitude of the challenges are clearly, daunting. Do you think that we always talk about being in sort of a hyper-partisan era, and it seems like every time you talk about it, it's even more partisan than it was the last time. Is this sort of a concept that has such enduring, sort of universally bipartisan appeal that this is likely to sort of continue on and grow from here, or are we in real sort of danger of this thing falling apart at some point?
No, I mean, it's got very good bipartisan support, fundamentally because it gives each side something that they've wanted for a long time. Democratic Party has wanted more investment against some of these issues. They wanted more investment against poverty. They wanted more investment in healthcare. They wanted more investment in housing, et cetera. And by embracing these kind of programs, you bring in all that capital that is accumulating at a very rapid rate outside of government into these kind of situations, right? So these programs result in more investment against some of these big challenges. So that makes Democrats very happy.
Right.
What Republicans have wanted, and they're right about this as well, is more accountability, more transparency, and they'd like a more conservative approach to how government provides services. And what that means is making sure you get outcomes before you pay. And nothing's more conservative than only paying if you get the desired outcome that you want. So this framework also gives Republicans some of the things that they've wanted for a long time. And I've always believed the best way to get wins in Washington or in any legislature is to give each side a win. Sure. Right? Because that's how people, they want to accomplish something.
Sure.
And so I think that's why it's been very bipartisan. And I think if we can do more of these programs, I think it could actually change the way our citizens think about government and some of the most important institutions in society, and including how they think about the private sector. Because right now, there's been this erosion in confidence in government, in so many important institutions in our society, and really in the private sector to some extent, right? Where people think their motives are not really the motives that are right for all the people of the society. So I think this can have both a short-term very positive impact, but also a very long-term positive impact in terms of changing the way people think about our most important institutions. And that really excites me.
Last question, I promise, but what do you think about, I mean, you must get challenged on this by some folks, probably on both ends of the spectrum a little bit, who say, the sector should stay in their own lanes.
Yes.
We have philanthropy, we have nonprofits, government, that's their role to solve social problems. Private sector's role is to make more money, accrete wealth to the, to the base of capital, and do things that the private sector is particularly good at doing.
Yeah.
Why would you try to sort of cross over? How would you respond to that?
So the way I'd respond to that is by saying, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, because it's all interconnected in a way, right? The private sector creates all the jobs, which generally creates all the revenues for the government. And most charitable and philanthropic engagement comes from someone at some point in time doing something in the private sector, right? So it's all kind of holistically interrelated. And I don't think those sectors necessarily think of themselves that way. I don't think the private sector believes it has no role in society. Whether for their own good, they know a stronger, healthier society is actually good for the bottom line, but I think increasingly companies are trying to be just in terms of how they behave, as well as focusing on their fiduciary duty, which is to make money for their shareholders. So I think that's kind of some people do look at it that way, and I think it's a narrow way to look at it. What I also try to point out to them is, in my own experience, when I've traveled around the world and I've seen good economies, I always find a situation where the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the government sector are working really well together. And that correlation is a very strong correlation if you go around the country. We talked about it here during the governor's remarks, where he talked about how well Utah was doing, which it is doing well. But there's a lot of collaboration here between those sectors. They're all kind of thinking about some of the same goals. They're not fighting with each other. That doesn't mean they're not going to have disagreements. They will. But fundamentally, you're trying to create a culture where these various stakeholders can work together towards these common goods. And I think it's in all of their interest, because if you do this, government looks smarter and people feel better about government. And the private sector is viewed as having a transformative role in society above and beyond whatever its commercial enterprise is. And you see that in a lot of communities where some of the most recognized businesses are important to community services. But this is taking it, and then there's this macro issue going on with capital in the world. I mean, governments are strained fiscally, and an enormous amount of capital is accumulating outside of government. And it's being concentrated, right? People talk about what's happening with wealth distribution, and it's true, the facts are undeniable. Now, my own opinion, at least in the United States of America, the most charitable nation on earth, most of that money ultimately is going to go back towards some kind of philanthropic endeavor. That's what most people do in this country when they have success, which is they set up foundations. You see these enduring foundations, Carnegie, Mellon, go back, look at what Bill Gates is doing. I mean, these are transformative things. So creating ways for that kind of capital that's generated in the private sector to easily work against some of the problems in society and also bring its innovation, right, and its kind of intellectual capital at the same time, I think is just a real win for the citizens of the country.
That's fantastic. Well, one reason we're really glad to have you at our conference is that we think of this conference as sort of a microcosm of some of the concepts that you're talking about. In particular, well, the bipartisanship is there on display. You got on the stage immediately after the Republican governor of Utah, and you guys had slightly different messages, but basically saying the same thing, which is that everybody ought to join hands together and let's collectively focus on solving some of these problems. The other thing that you get here, which I think is a perfect sort of illustration of what you're talking about, is we have folks representing every sector of society. The panel of folks that we had come on stage just after you were sort of the world's preeminent academic experts in the social or the entrepreneurship and kind of impact investing space. Right. So we have the academics here, the nonprofit, social enterprise, private sector interests, and then of course policymakers. And getting all those folks in the same room to talk about issues that affect us all is I think, a really powerful approach. So we're tremendously honored to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for your leadership in Congress on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again.